Decision Before Dawn was not just Anatole Litvak's most politically audacious film, it was a Best Picture nominee that asked American audiences, 6 years after the most destructive war in human history, to mourn the death of a German soldier who had betrayed his own country on America's behalf. A film written by a man whose Office of Strategic Services, Wartime Service, provided its source material, scored by a Jewish composer who had been beaten by Nazi sympathizers in Berlin and fled for his life, photographed by an Austrian Jewish cinematographer returning to Germany for the first time since his own flight from the Nazis, and built around a star who had deserted from the Wehrmacht on the exact date that the film's shooting schedule would later assign as his character's capture. We are digging into the wreckage of Decision Before Dawn with 15 secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside cinematographer interviews, producer correspondence, Berg Theater records, and the kind of biographical intersections that only become visible when you understand how many of the people who made this film had personally lived the history it was depicting. The title, Decision Before Dawn, operates on the precise threshold of moral action, the moment before light, before visibility, before the consequences of a choice become available to scrutiny. It is the title of a film about men who must decide whether to trust someone whose trustworthiness cannot be verified in the dark before any of the evidence that might inform the decision has been assembled. What 20th Century Fox's marketing division approved as a serviceable thriller title was, in the most careful reading, a philosophical statement about the condition of all moral reasoning under wartime pressure. Decisions must be made before you know what they cost, before the dawn reveals what your choice has produced, in the permanent darkness of incomplete information. The film's moral argument that Happy's decision to spy against his own country is simultaneously treasonous and honorable, and that no subsequent rationalization can resolve that contradiction, is contained entirely in those 4 words. Critics who received the film as an exciting spy thriller missed the title's instruction. The decision the film is actually about is not whether Happy will succeed, it is whether his choice can be called right. Anatole Litvak arrived at Decision Before Dawn carrying a biographical weight that no other director in Hollywood could have brought to it. Born in Kiev to Jewish parents, trained in the Soviet film industry, he had built his early directing career in Germany at the UFA studios before the Nazi consolidation of power in January 1933 forced him to flee, first to England, then to France, then to Hollywood, losing his country and his language with each border crossing. He had spent the war years as a full colonel in the United States Army, supervising the filming of the D-Day Normandy landings, directing aerial warfare sequences with the 8th Air Force, co-directing the Why We Fight documentary series with Frank Capra. He had received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, the French Military Cross, and the British Order of the British Empire. When he returned to Germany in 1950 to make Decision Before Dawn, his first time on German soil since his flight 17 years earlier, he was returning not as a refugee but as a conqueror, not as a victim but as the man who had helped document the regime's destruction. The film he made was not a film of triumph. It was a film of elegy for the Germany he had lost and the people the regime had consumed. No biographical alignment in Hollywood history more precisely matched the subject of its film to the experience of its director. But the real problem was that the man Litvak had trusted to write that film carried his own equally precise wartime credentials. Peter Viertel's adaptation of George Howe's novel Call It Treason was not the work of a screenwriter imagining wartime Germany from the safety of a Hollywood office. Viertel had served in the Office of Strategic Services, the American intelligence organization that preceded the Central Intelligence Agency, and had been assigned to precisely the kind of unit that the film depicts. The apparatus that recruited German prisoners of war as agents sent them back across enemy lines and waited to see whether they returned. The experiences he brought to the screenplay were not research, they were memory. The novel's title, which Viertel preserved as the moral center of his adaptation, identified the film's subject with a directness that the studio's marketing materials preferred to soften. What Happy was doing was treason by every definition available to the country he served. Viertel had watched real men make that decision. He had been part of the apparatus that asked them to make it. What the screenplay captures, the American officers' genuine ambivalence about whether what they were doing was honorable or merely expedient, is the ambivalence of a man who had been on both sides of that conversation. Karl Zuckmayer, the exiled German playwright and anti-Nazi resistance figure, was brought in uncredited to refine the German dialogue's authenticity, adding a third voice of biographical authority to a screenplay already dense with lived experience. 3 men who had each personally navigated the moral landscape of wartime Germany assembled a script that described that landscape from the inside. This is exactly why the film feels like testimony rather than fiction. The casting of Oskar Werner as Happy carries a biographical correspondence so precise that it crosses the line between casting and documentation. Werner had been drafted into the German army, despite his pacifist convictions and his hatred of the regime, had continued acting at the Burgtheater in Vienna for as long as his military assignments permitted leaves of absence, and had deserted in 1944, fleeing with his first wife and infant daughter to the Vienna woods, where they hid in the house of a friend until the war ended. His desertion date, recorded in Austrian military records, was in late 1944. The production's shooting schedule assigned Happy's capture, the moment the film's narrative begins, the moment of his transformation from German soldier into American agent, to December 8, 1944. The date on which the fictional Happy was supposed to have been caught was almost precisely the date on which the real Oskar Werner had actually fled. When Werner played Happy's initial interrogation by American officers, the scene in which a German soldier first offers to betray his country in exchange for the chance to help end the war, he was not performing a historical imagination. He was performing with the precise authority of first-hand knowledge, what he had himself decided. Litvak, who had researched the real soldier who inspired Happy before beginning production, was apparently aware of this biographical alignment. He cast Werner anyway. He cast Werner because of it. Franz Planer, born Franz Planer in Austria, working in Hollywood under the anglicized credit Frank Planer, since his own flight from the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1937, photographed Decision Before Dawn on his first return to German-speaking territory since leaving 13 years earlier. The Encyclopedia of Cinematographers notes that accounts differ on whether the location scouting trips constituted Planer's first visits to Germany since his departure, but the evidence suggests they did. His preparation for the film had been methodical. Months of location scouting through the rubble of Würzburg, Nuremberg, Mannheim, and Munich, finding which specific streets, which specific interiors, which specific landscapes would communicate the required moral geography. What he produced was described by film critic and historian Lottie Eisner as placing him among the greatest cinematographers of the Weimar era, and what the Encyclopedia of Cinematographers called the only genuine example of an American neorealist style in the 1940s. The assessment that carries the most weight comes from Francis Coppola, who 40 years later had the film screened as an example for his own production teams of how location photography at the highest level was done. Planer and Litvak had agreed on a precise statement of intent. Their aim, as Planer documented in a production interview, was to make a picture with all the blunt realism of a documentary. What they produced was a Hollywood film that looked like no other Hollywood film of its era, because two men who had each escaped the ruins they were now photographing brought to the camera an authority of witness that no American-born filmmaker could have supplied. Franz Waxman's assignment to score Decision Before Dawn was not a coincidence of studio scheduling. Waxman, born Franz Waxman to Jewish parents in Silesia, the composer of Sunset Boulevard and A Place in the Sun, the only man ever to win consecutive Academy Awards for Best Score, had been beaten by Nazi sympathizers in the streets of Berlin in 1934, an attack of sufficient severity that he left Germany immediately and permanently, arriving in Hollywood within months. His brother and part of his family were subsequently exterminated at Auschwitz. He never discussed this publicly. His son John, interviewed decades later, said that his father and the other émigré composers of his generation did not look back, they were interested in the future. What Waxman brought to Decision Before Dawn was something no studio assignment could have specified. The precise musical intelligence of a man whose understanding of Germany's moral collapse was not historical, but biographical, and whose ability to score a German soldier's death with genuine grief rather than nationalist vindication was built on the specific experience of having been that soldier's country's victim. The score was never nominated for an Academy Award. The film itself was. The music that gave Happy's death its emotional weight was produced by a man whose family had been killed by the regime Happy was dying to destroy. Among the largely German cast assembled by Litvak for Decision Before Dawn, recruited specifically because the production required actors who understood the culture and language from the inside rather than from the outside, were two men whose subsequent careers would make the production list read like an inadvertent talent showcase. Klaus Kinski appears in an early scene as a prisoner in a performance so brief that most viewers have never noticed it. Gert Frobe, who would become Auric Goldfinger 11 years later, one of the most recognizable villains in the history of cinema, appears as another minor figure. Both men were at the beginning of careers that the film's production records could not have predicted. Litvak had assembled them alongside Hans Christian Bleck, whose performance as Tiger drew comparisons with the very best German screen acting of the post-war era, and O.E. Hasse, whose embodiment of the German officer class produced what several reviewers identified as the film's most frightening performance. Not a monster, but a professional, doing his institutional duty with the calm efficiency of a man who has not paused to examine what his institution is. The future Goldfinger was in the same film as the future greatest Austrian actor of his generation. Neither knew what they were going to become. The film that gathered them did not know either. George Howe's source novel was titled Call It Treason, 3 words that the film's opening prologue, its production materials, and its American marketing all carefully avoided repeating. The film adopted the euphemistic line crossers to describe what Happy and Tiger were doing. The army called them agents. The publicity called them intelligence operatives. Nobody in the film's official materials called them what the novel had honestly named, traitors. Howe, who had served with the Office of Strategic Services unit that actually ran these operations, understood the moral weight of what was being asked of the men his unit recruited. His novel's title was an act of naming that the institutional apparatus surrounding its adaptation consistently refused to perform. What the studio understood, and what the film's screenplay partially obscured, was that the program being depicted was one in which the American military had systematically recruited men to betray their country, asked them to risk execution as spies and certain death as traitors, and then, as Happy's closing narration makes clear, offered them no formal recognition, no guaranteed protection, and no acknowledgement of what their courage had cost. The novel called this treason. The film called it bravery. The distinction is the film's deepest unresolved tension, and it was visible in the title they removed. The production notes distributed to press by 20th Century Fox stated that the citizens of Würzburg, Nuremberg, and Mannheim were forewarned of filming by newspaper and radio announcements, a logistical courtesy required by the fact that several of the film's battle sequences were staged in areas still under American military occupation and still physically recognizable as the sites of actual destruction. The bombing sequences in the film are not recreations. The buildings that collapse are buildings that were already structurally compromised by the actual bombing that had preceded the camera by 5 years. Litvak was not filming a reconstruction of a destroyed Germany. He was filming the destruction itself, still present, still legible, still inhabited by the people who had survived it. The refugees who passed through the background of Happy's mission across Bavaria are not extras costumed to suggest displacement. They are people who were displaced, living in the ruins of the country the film is describing, recruited from the population of a society that was still processing what had been done to it and done in its name. The documentary quality that critics praised was documentary. The ruins in the frame were the ruins. This is exactly why the film looks unlike anything else made in Hollywood in 1951, because Hollywood in 1951 was not, in any other production, filming inside the actual events it was depicting. Among the details preserved in the TCM production record, and absent from every piece of marketing material the studio released, is an act of personal reckoning that Litvak performed before principal photography began. The real soldier whose story had inspired George Howe's novel, and whose life had been transfigured into Happy's fictional biography, had parents still living in Germany when the production began scouting locations. Litvak sought them out and visited them. What those parents told him has been preserved in a single documented exchange. They were disappointed that the Americans had not treated their son more honorably after the war, given his courage in spying for the Allied cause. Their son had risked execution, had walked through enemy territory on American orders, had delivered intelligence that served American objectives, and had received, in return, the anonymity that the program required, and the gratitude that the program never formalized. The parents of the man who inspired Happy told the director of the film that celebrated their son's sacrifice that the Americans had not honored what their son had done. Litvak did not alter the film's ending to address this complaint. What he did was make the film with the knowledge of that disappointment embedded in every scene that asked Happy to trust that his sacrifice was meaningful. Decision Before Dawn belongs to a tradition that Litvak never publicly named, and that American critics in 1951 were not yet equipped to identify with precision. The semi-documentary visual grammar that Franz Waxman constructed, entirely on location, with available light augmented rather than replaced by artificial sources, with non-professional faces filling the background of every street scene, derived directly from the Italian neo-realist films that had been produced in the rubble of post-war Europe in the years immediately preceding the Decision Before Dawn shoot. Rossellini's Rome, Open City, and De Sica's Bicycle Thieves had established the aesthetic of devastated urban landscape as moral vocabulary, The broken city as evidence of institutional failure, the ordinary person moving through ruins as the war film's true subject. Litvak absorbed this tradition completely, bringing it to bear on German rather than Italian ruins, deploying it in service of American studio financing, and producing a Hollywood film that the Encyclopedia of Cinematographers identified as the only genuine American example of neorealism. The films it owed everything to were never acknowledged in its production materials. The tradition it was extending was not credited. But the critical vocabulary that would eventually be developed to describe what the film was doing had been coined in Rome, not in Hollywood, and the men who coined it would have recognized Decision Before Dawn as one of their own. The most consequential assessment of Franz Planer's cinematography in Decision Before Dawn was not delivered in 1951. It was delivered approximately 40 years later, when Francis Coppola, preparing a major production and seeking examples of location photography at the highest level, had the film screened for his own production teams as a masterclass. The Encyclopedia of Cinematographers preserves this fact without elaboration. Coppola screened Decision Before Dawn as an example. The film that had received a Best Picture nomination and then been gradually absorbed into the category of honorable forgotten classics was being used by one of the most commercially successful directors in Hollywood history as a teaching text. What Coppola's teams were studying was the specific problem Planer had solved: how to photograph a morally complex story about human beings in a landscape of institutional devastation in a way that allowed the landscape to carry moral meaning without displacing the human beings who moved through it. That problem had not been solved before Planer solved it on the streets of Würzburg. It has rarely been solved as elegantly since. And the director who recognized this screened the film quietly, without announcement, as a private lesson. The cinematographer who deserved the public credit continued to receive none. The critical reception of Decision Before Dawn at its December 1951 release was divided along a fault line that tells you precisely where the film's argument was most threatening. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times called it a stirring drama and commended what he described as a fair approximation of a nation's moral collapse, while concluding that as a social document the film ultimately failed to answer its own central question: why does a spy risk his life? The criticism was simultaneously the most perceptive and the most obtuse response the film received. Crowther had identified the film's central question accurately. He had then concluded that the film's failure to answer it was a deficiency. What he had missed was that the failure to answer was the answer, that the film's entire moral architecture was built on the proposition that the question of why Happy risks his life cannot be answered because no answer available to 1951 American cinema could have been adequate to what the question actually cost. The French audience understood this differently. Thousands of French admirers of the film signed a large scroll which they sent to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, insisting the film receive an Oscar. The Americans who voted on the award did not agree. The French, who had lived through occupation and understood what it meant to be asked to betray your country for a cause you believed in, recognized what the Americans were still learning to see. The 75 years since Decision Before Dawn's release have produced a historical record that renders its moral argument not merely legitimate but urgent. The actual program that the film depicts, the American military's wartime use of German prisoners as intelligence agents, was declassified and documented in subsequent decades, confirming Howe's account in every essential particular and adding the detail that the men who served in this capacity received, in many cases, exactly the non-recognition that Happy's closing narration describes. The Cold War that followed the Second World War reproduced the film's central situation on an industrial scale. Men and women recruited to betray their countries for the intelligence services of nations they were not citizens of, promised protection that could not always be delivered, asked to make the decision before dawn in the permanent darkness of information that their handlers controlled, and they did not. Decision Before Dawn was not a film about 1944. It was a film about the permanent condition of anyone asked to trust an institution with their life, in exchange for a cause the institution defines and the individual can only accept or refuse. That condition did not end in 1945. It has been the permanent condition of every intelligence program conducted by every nation in the 75 years since. The film that survived, photographed by a man who had fled the country he was now filming, scored by a man whose family had been killed by the regime the film depicts, written by a man who had personally operated the apparatus the film describes, directed by a man returning to the country that had expelled him, starring a man who had made the same decision as his character in the same months his character was supposed to have made it, is as densely biographical as any film in Hollywood history. Litvak visited Happy's parents and learned that the Americans had not honored what their son had done. He made the film anyway, with that knowledge in it. Werner played his own Desertion and called it by another name. Planer returned to Germany and found it still broken and photographed the breakage with the precise detachment of a man who had been broken in the same place. Waxman scored a German soldier's death with genuine grief and never discussed why he understood that grief as well as he did. And the French signed a scroll and sent it to the Academy, and the Academy did not listen, and the film was nominated and lost, and Crowther said it failed to answer its own central question, and the question it refused to answer has been the central question of every intelligence program conducted in every country since the war ended. But here is the question that Decision Before Dawn leaves embedded in its closing narration, in that final statement that no man is lost as long as he is remembered. If the most honest film ever made about what a government asks of the people it recruits to die for, causes it defines and controls was made by the refugees and exiles and deserters who had personally paid the price of that transaction, people whose biographical authority was the only thing that made the film's honesty possible, then what does it mean that the institutions those people served never fully acknowledged what they owed them? And if the answer is that institutions by their nature cannot acknowledge the full cost of what they extract from individuals, which of the promises being made to the people being recruited right now will turn out to be the promises that nobody honored? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see Decision Before Dawn, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.